December 17, 1944. The Barrages crossroads, roughly 2 miles southeast of Normandy, Belgium. A column of American soldiers from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion is sitting in an open field under guard. They have been captured less than an hour ago by Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, driving west through the Ardennes in the opening hours of what the Germans are calling Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Americans have their hands up. Some are standing, some are kneeling in the frozen mud. Before what happens next, before the event that history will remember as the Normandy massacre, the German soldiers walk down the line of prisoners and begin stripping them. Watches, rings, cigarettes, gloves. They take everything of value, methodically, man by man. A sergeant from Wisconsin named Henry Zack, who will survive what comes after by lying motionless under the bodies of the men who do not, will remember this scene decades later in an oral history recorded by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. The prisoners were stripped of everything before what came next. Here is the detail that matters for this investigation. Almost every American prisoner in that field was wearing a wristwatch. The Germans noticed. They noticed because in their army, a wristwatch was not something an ordinary rifleman owned. In the Wehrmacht, a service watch was a controlled piece of government property. It had a serial number stamped into the caseback. That serial number was recorded in the soldier's paybook, his Soldbuch, and the watch was expected to be returned when the soldier was discharged, transferred, or killed. Wristwatches in the German military were issued primarily to officers, to pilots, to U-boat crews, to artillery specialists, to signals operators, to the men whose duties specifically required precise timekeeping. The average German infantryman, the Lanzer freezing in his foxhole with a Mauser across his knees, did not have a watch. He could not afford one on his pay, and his duties, according to the Wehrmacht's supply system, did not require one. He was told what time to attack. He was told what time to eat. He was told what time to sleep. Time, in the German infantry, flowed downward from officers who had watches to enlisted men who did not. And yet, across the frozen field at Barrages, every American private, every corporal, every truck driver, and cook and forward observer appeared to have a precision timepiece strapped to his wrist. The same black dial, the same white numerals, the same sweep second hand, as if someone had decided that in the American army, even the lowest-ranking man in the lowest-ranking unit deserved to know exactly what time it was down to the second. Who had decided that? Where had all those watches come from? And what did it mean that one army could put a watch on the wrist of every man in the field, while the other army could not put a watch on the wrist of most of them? Those questions might sound small. They are not. They are, in fact, one of the clearest windows into the reason the German army lost the war in the West. Not because of watches, because of what the watches represented, because a wristwatch is a small, precise, personal object, and the ability to manufacture millions of them, to distribute them across an ocean, to strap them onto the wrists of men who would have been factory workers and farmhands and grocery clerks 6 months earlier, was a demonstration of industrial capacity so vast that no amount of tactical brilliance on the German side could overcome it. The watch on the American private's wrist was not just telling him the time. It was telling the German officer something about the war he was losing, if he had the vocabulary to read it. It was telling him that the country he was fighting could afford to mass-produce precision and hand it out as standard equipment. It was telling him that the assembly lines he had been assured could never outproduce German craftsmanship were, in fact, doing exactly that, one wristwatch at a time, one soldier at a time, 1,000,000 times over. Most German officers did not have that vocabulary. Not in 1944, not yet. They would find it later, in prisoner of war camps and in post-war memoirs, when they finally began to describe what it had felt like to fight an enemy who seemed to have everything, in quantities that had no rational explanation, distributed down to a level of the military hierarchy that the German system had never considered worth equipping. This is the story of the wristwatch that won the war. Not one watch, millions of them, and of the country that built them, the factories that made them, the doctrine that required them, and the army that strapped them on and used them to coordinate a kind of warfare the Germans could see but could not match. To understand how a wristwatch became a weapon, we have to go back further than the Second World War. We have to go back to a time when no soldier on earth wore a watch on his wrist, because wristwatches were not for soldiers, they were for women. In the summer of 1914, when the armies of Europe mobilized for what they believed would be a short, glorious war, the standard military timepiece was a pocket watch. Officers carried them in breast pockets or waistcoat pockets, attached to chains, and consulted them with a deliberate two-handed gesture that had not changed in 100 years. Pull out the watch. Flip open the case. Read the time. Snap it shut. Put it back. The wristwatch existed, but it was considered a piece of women's jewelry, a bracelet with a dial. No serious military man would wear one. The French called it a montre bracelet. The British called it a wristlet. Both names carried the faint scent of the drawing room, not the battlefield. The Western Front destroyed that prejudice in about 6 weeks. The problem was simple and lethal. An officer leading men across no man's land needed to know the exact second the artillery barrage was scheduled to lift so his men could advance behind it. This was not a matter of convenience. It was a matter of survival. The creeping barrage, the rolling wall of shell fire that advanced ahead of the infantry at a fixed rate, typically 100 yards every 3 or 4 minutes, was the single most important tactical innovation of the First World War. It was also one of the most dangerous. The barrage worked only if the infantry stayed close behind it, close enough to reach the enemy trenches before the defenders could recover from the shelling and man their machine guns. Too far behind, and the defenders had time to set up. Too far ahead, and the infantry walked into its own shells. The margin was measured in seconds and yards, and the only instrument that could keep a man on the right side of that margin was a watch he could read at a glance, in the dark, while moving, under fire, without stopping to use both hands. Officers began strapping pocket watches to their wrists with crude leather guards, improvised straps made from equipment webbing or cut-down harness leather. Then watchmakers in London and Geneva began producing purpose-built wrist models with shielded crystals and luminous radium-painted dials that could be read in a trench at night. The Goldsmiths and Silversmiths Company of London produced a so-called trench watch with a hinged metal grille over the crystal to protect it from shrapnel. Omega produced a small wristwatch for British officers that became so associated with frontline service that owning one became a mark of having been to the sharp end. By 1917, the wristwatch had become standard equipment for British and French officers. By 1918, it was standard for NCOs and many enlisted specialists, particularly in the artillery and the signals branches. The thing that had been considered feminine jewelry 4 years earlier was now the mark of a fighting man. The cultural reversal was total and irreversible. By around 1930, wristwatches were outselling pocket watches by enormous margins. Some contemporary trade publications estimated the ratio at 50-1. The pocket watch was dead. The wristwatch had won, and the military implications of that victory were about to become enormous. Between the wars, every major army understood that synchronized timekeeping was essential to modern combined arms warfare. Artillery had to fire on schedule. Infantry had to advance on schedule. Armor had to arrive on schedule. Air support had to strike on schedule. The more complex the operation, the more precisely every element had to be timed, and the more men who needed to know exactly what second it was. The question was not whether soldiers needed watches. The question was how many soldiers needed them, and how good the watches had to be. The German answer and the American answer to that question would diverge in ways that neither side fully understood until they met each other on the battlefields of North Africa and Europe. And the divergence would reveal something about each country that went far deeper than horology. The German military watch system was, like most things in the Wehrmacht, precise, hierarchical, and limited by design. The standard German service watch, known to collectors today by the letters DH stamped on the case back, was manufactured by more than 30 companies. most of them Swiss. Firms like Omega, Longines, Record, Buren, Zenith, Helvetia, and many others produced watches to German military specifications. The movements were typically 15 joule, often built around a common Swiss caliber called the A. Styled 1130, which was so prevalent in German service watches that collectors later nicknamed it the Wehrmacht movement. The watches had black dials with luminous numerals and hands, were reasonably accurate, and were built to survive field conditions. For the Luftwaffe, Germany commissioned a separate category of oversized observation watches called the B-Uhr, produced by 5 elite manufacturers, A. Lange and Sony of Glashütte, IWC of Schaffhausen in Switzerland, Lacko of Pforzheim, Stoer of Hornburg in the Black Forest, and Wempe of Hamburg. These were precision instruments of extraordinary quality, 55 mm in diameter, far larger than a standard wristwatch, designed so that a pilot could read the time at a glance in a vibrating cockpit at altitude in poor light. The movements were accurate to within a few seconds per day. They were, by any measure, among the finest military watches ever made, and they remain today among the most prized collectibles in the world of military horology. The Kriegsmarine similarly had its own requirements. Hanhardt and Tutemer produced flyback chronographs for naval aviators, capable of timing torpedo runs and patrol legs with superb mechanical precision. But all of these watches, the DH service watches and the B-Uhr observation watches alike, were controlled issue items. They were government property. They were serial numbered, catalogued, assigned to specific personnel, and tracked through the military bureaucracy. A German infantryman who received a DH watch had its number entered in his Soldbuch, alongside his blood type and his unit assignment. If the watch was lost or damaged, it had to be reported. If the soldier was killed, the watch was supposed to be recovered and reissued. The system was efficient in the way German systems were always efficient. It was also, by its nature, exclusive. There were never enough watches to go around. As one military watch historian summarized it, the lower enlisted ranks could not afford a watch, and their duties rarely required that they be issued one. Contracted watches seldom were able to meet the demand of the German war machine. This is important. Read it again. The German army, the army of Blitzkrieg, the army that had conquered France in 6 weeks, could not produce enough wristwatches to put one on every soldier. The contracted supply could not meet the demand. The watches went to the men who needed them most, officers, specialists, and aircrew, and the rest of the army fought without them. The American answer to the same question was different in a way that was, when you step back and look at it, almost absurd in its ambition. The United States Army did not just want watches for its officers and specialists. It wanted watches for everyone who might conceivably need to coordinate with anyone else, which, in a modern army, meant a staggering number of people. And it did not want ordinary watches. It wanted watches that could be synchronized to the second. In 1940, as the United States began to rearm, the Army Air Corps issued a specification that would become one of the most important and least remembered documents of the entire war. It was called the A-11, designated under United States Army Air Forces Specification number 9427834. The A-11 was not a watch, it was a standard. A set of requirements that any watch had to meet before the United States military would buy it. The requirements were precise and exacting, engineered not by watchmakers but by military planners who understood exactly what a fighting man needed from a timepiece and exactly what would get him killed if the timepiece could not deliver it. Black dial with white Arabic numerals, because white on black is the easiest combination to read in low light. A sweep second hand at the center of the dial, not in a small subdial, because a center sweep hand can be read at a glance from any angle, while a subdial requires the wearer to tilt his wrist and focus. A minimum of 15 joules in the movement, because jeweled bearings reduce friction and increase accuracy over time, and a watch that drifts more than 30 seconds per day is a watch that will fall out of synchronization before the end of a single operation. A dust-resistant and moisture-resistant case, because the environments these watches would operate in included North African deserts, Pacific Island jungles, and European winters. A chromium-plated brass case rather than steel, because steel was needed for rifles and tanks and ships, and the watch had to be built from whatever the war economy could spare. A power reserve of at least 30 hours, so that a man who forgot to wind his watch before falling asleep in a foxhole would still have a running timepiece when he woke up. And one feature that set it apart from almost every civilian watch on Earth: a hacking movement. Hacking meant that when you pulled the crown to set the time, the second hand stopped. It froze in place. It did not keep ticking. It waited. This was not a convenience feature. This was a tactical feature. It meant that an officer could stand in front of his platoon, pull the crown on his watch, call out a reference time from a radio signal or a headquarters clock, and every man in the platoon could set his watch to the same second. When the officer pushed the crown back in, every second hand in the unit started moving again at the same instant. 30 men. One time. Accurate to the second. The companies that won the contracts to produce the A11 were three of the most established names in American watchmaking: Elgin, based in Illinois; Waltham, based in Massachusetts; Bulova, based in New York. Each produced its own version of the A11, using its own movement. The Elgin 539, the Waltham 6-0 Premier, the Bulova 10AK. The dials were identical across all three manufacturers: black, white numerals, luminous hands. If you had lined up an Elgin, a Waltham, and a Bulova A11 on a table, you would have had difficulty telling them apart without flipping them over. But the A11 was only part of the story. The War Department also specified a simpler, cheaper watch, designated in Technical Manual 9-1575 as the Ordnance Watch. This was a 7-jewel movement without the sweep second hand and without the hacking feature, intended for general ground troops who needed a reliable field watch but did not require the split-second synchronization capability of the A11. The Ordnance Watch was less precise, less expensive, and more widely distributed. Together, the A11 and the Ordnance Watch represented two tiers of American military timekeeping, one for precision coordination and one for everyday field use, both produced in quantities that dwarfed anything the German supply system could match. There was also a fourth company, and its contribution was in some ways the most remarkable of all. The Hamilton Watch Company of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was in 1941 the premier American watchmaker. Hamilton made the most respected, most accurate, most expensive watches in the country. Their movements were the standard by which American railroad conductors, who needed chronometric precision to prevent collisions on single-track lines, judged their timepieces. A Hamilton watch in a man's pocket meant something in 1941. It meant precision. It meant reliability. It meant that the man who carried it took time seriously. When the war came, Hamilton made a decision that no other American watch company made with quite the same totality. In 1942, Hamilton stopped producing watches for civilians entirely. Not partially. Not mostly. Entirely. Every movement, every case, every dial, and every hand that came off Hamilton's production lines from 1942 to 1945 went to the United States military. The company produced navigation watches for the Navy, marine chronometers for ships, aircraft clocks, and timing instruments for everything from bomb fuses to artillery systems. The marine chronometer alone, the precision instrument that allowed a ship's navigator to determine longitude at sea, was produced in quantities exceeding 10,000 units, with roughly 9,000 going to the Navy and the rest to merchant shipping and the Army. Over the course of the war, Hamilton manufactured more than 1 million military timepieces. For this, the company received the Army-Navy E Award, the highest production honor the United States government gave to civilian manufacturers. Hamilton's contribution was not just industrial, it was, in a sense, cultural. Here was the finest watchmaker in the country, the maker of watches that railroad conductors and bank presidents wore as a mark of professional distinction, and it had turned its entire operation over to the task of putting precision instruments into the hands of ordinary soldiers and sailors. It was as if the most exclusive craftsmen in the nation had looked at the war, looked at the men being sent to fight it, and decided that every one of them deserved the same quality of instrument that had previously been reserved for the privileged few. The American watch production effort was part of a larger industrial mobilization that remains, 80 years later, almost difficult to believe. The War Production Board, the federal agency that directed American industrial conversion, supervised the production of $183 billion worth of weapons and supplies between 1942 and 1945. That figure represented approximately 40% of the entire world's output of munitions during the war. The United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the other Allied nations together produced roughly another 30%. The Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, produced the remaining 30%. One country was outproducing 3 countries. The civilian watch industry was a tiny fraction of that effort, but it was a representative fraction. Elgin made military watches and bomb-fuse timers. Waltham made military watches and aircraft instruments. Bulova made military watches and altitude triggers for bombs. Hamilton made everything the Navy asked for and then made more. To fill the gap in the civilian market created by diverting these companies to war production, the United States imported Swiss watches in enormous quantities. The Swiss government recorded that in just the first 6 months of 1945, 4,059,407 watches and watch movements were exported from Switzerland to the United States alone. 4 million watches in 6 months, to replace the ones American factories were too busy making for the military to sell to civilians. Now hold that number in your mind and compare it to what was happening on the German side. Germany's precision manufacturing industry was concentrated in a handful of specialized towns. Glashütte in Saxony, the historic home of A. Lange and Sony and the German fine watchmaking tradition. Pforzheim in Baden, the center of Germany's jewelry and precision instrument industry. The Black Forest region, home to countless small workshops producing clocks, timing mechanisms, and instrument components. By 1943, all of these centers had been diverted from watchmaking to war production. Not watch production for soldiers, war production. The same precision skills that made a watch movement could make a timing fuse for an artillery shell or a detonator for a torpedo. Germany needed fuses more than it needed watches, and so the watchmakers became fuse makers. At Glashütte, up to 3,000 prisoners of war and forced laborers worked 12-hour shifts, producing chronometers and time delay fuses for the military. The watches the soldiers needed were being consumed by the weapons the soldiers fired. And then, on the night of February 23, 1945, the Royal Air Force came to Pforzheim. 379 aircraft, 367 of them, Avro Lancasters, arrived over the city at 7:50 in the evening and bombed for 22 minutes. When they left, Pforzheim was essentially gone. 83% of the city was destroyed. Approximately 17,600 people, 31.4% of the entire population, were dead. The British Bombing Survey Unit later described it as probably the greatest proportion of a town destroyed in one raid during the war. Pforzheim's precision manufacturing infrastructure, the workshops, the tool rooms, the trained craftsmen, the supply chains, was obliterated in less than half an hour. Germany's ability to produce precision instruments of any kind, watches or fuses or anything else, took a blow from which it would never recover before the war ended 10 weeks later. This was the trajectory of German precision manufacturing, a trajectory that would end with Pforzheim's destruction 10 weeks before the war's end. And it was the industrial context in which German soldiers had been stripping watches off American prisoners at crossroads and checkpoints across the Western Front since the autumn of 1944. They were not just stealing souvenirs. They were acquiring precision instruments that their own supply system could no longer reliably provide. The watch on an American private's wrist was, in a very literal sense, something the German war economy was increasingly unable to produce for its own men. But the watches were more than symbols of industrial capacity. They were weapons. and the place where they became weapons, the place where synchronized time ceased to be a convenience and became a matter of survival for tens of thousands of men, was the coast of Normandy on the morning of June 6, 1944. Every like on this video is a small act of respect for the men who wore those watches into the most dangerous hours of their lives. It costs nothing, and it keeps their story visible a little longer. The Allied invasion of Normandy was, and remains, the most complex, synchronized military operation in the history of warfare. The timetable that governed D-Day was measured not in hours but in minutes, and in some phases, in seconds. The operation involved 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men crossing the English Channel in a coordinated sequence that had been planned down to increments of 5 minutes. Every element had to arrive at its assigned position at its assigned time, or the elements behind it would stack up, collide, or land in the wrong place under the wrong conditions. Airborne troops from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were scheduled to drop behind the beaches beginning shortly after midnight. Their mission was to seize bridges, block roads, and create confusion in the German rear before the beach landings began. The Pathfinder teams that jumped first carried luminous markers and radar beacons that had to be activated at precisely designated times to guide the main body of paratroopers to their drop zones. A Pathfinder team that was 2 minutes late would cause hundreds of paratroopers to land in the wrong field. Some did. The ones who landed in the right fields landed there because the men with the beacons had looked at their watches and activated their equipment at the correct second. Naval bombardment was scheduled to begin at 5:45 in the morning. The first wave of infantry was scheduled to hit the beaches at 6:30. Each beach had its own timetable. Each wave within each beach had its own. Each naval fire support ship had a schedule of targets keyed to the minute. Each squadron of bombers had a time on target, calculated to suppress the defenders just long enough for the infantry to reach the seawall. A destroyer that fired 2 minutes past its assigned window risked hitting landing craft that had already entered the target zone. A bomber squadron that released early risked dropping its payload on the men it was supposed to be supporting. The entire structure depended on one thing. Every man involved, from the admiral on the command ship to the private in the landing craft, had to be working from the same clock. If the naval bombardment ran long by 3 minutes, the landing craft would drive into their own navy's shells. If the airborne drops came late by 15 minutes, the paratroopers would land in daylight and be cut to pieces. If an infantry company crossed the line of departure 60 seconds early, the creeping barrage ahead of them would not have moved far enough forward, and their own artillery would kill them. This is what the hacking movement in the A11 watch was designed for. Before the operation, at a designated synchronization point, an officer would call out a time hack. Every man with a watch, and by 1944, this included NCOs, forward observers, radio men, platoon sergeants, and in many units, squad leaders, would pull his crown, set his dial, and wait for the mark. On the mark, every crown went back in. Every second hand started at 0. Every watch in the unit was now counting the same seconds. The Germans had the same theoretical capability. Their officers and specialists had watches. They could synchronize, but the synchronization only reached as deep into the unit as the watches did, and in most German units, that meant it stopped at the platoon leader. Below him, the men relied on voice commands, hand signals, and the visible actions of the men in front of them. They moved when they saw their officer move. They fired when they heard the order. They advanced when the man ahead of them advanced. Time, for the German rifleman, was not something he read on his wrist. It was something that happened to him. For the American rifleman, time was increasingly something he carried with him. And this changed, in ways that are difficult to overstate, the way the American army fought. Consider what synchronized time means at the squad level. A 12-man American infantry squad, operating in the hedgerow country of Normandy in July of 1944, is advancing toward a German position behind an earthen bank. The squad leader has coordinated with the platoon sergeant, who has coordinated with the company commander, who has called in a fire mission from the artillery battery 3 miles to the rear. The artillery is scheduled to fire a concentration on the German position at 1400 hours and 12 minutes. The barrage will last 90 seconds. At 1400 hours and 13 minutes and 30 seconds, the barrage will shift 200 meters to the north. The squad has to be moving the instant the barrage shifts, because the Germans who survived will need approximately 15 seconds to come up from cover and man their weapons. 15 seconds. That is the window. If the squad moves at 1400 hours and 13 minutes and 15 seconds, it walks into its own artillery. If it moves at 1400 hours and 14 minutes, the Germans are already firing. The squad leader looks at his watch. The second hand sweeps. He waits. He counts the seconds. He says go. He can do this because he has a watch. The German squad leader on the receiving end of this attack often could not do the equivalent, because he did not. This scene played out thousands of times across the bocage. The hedgerow country was a nightmare of close combat in compartmented terrain, tiny fields bounded by earthen banks and dense vegetation where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. In this terrain, the normal methods of battlefield coordination, visual signals from officers, voice commands carried on the wind, runners carrying written messages, were all degraded or useless. You could not see the man in the next field. You could not hear him over the sound of gunfire. You could not send a runner because the runner would be shot crossing the open ground between the hedge banks. What you could do, if you had a synchronized watch, was agree on a time in advance and trust that every man in the operation was reading the same second on the same dial. The American artillery in Normandy fired an average of far more rounds per day than the German artillery opposing it, a disparity that never ceased to astonish German defenders who had to ration their own shells carefully. But the sheer volume of American fire was only half the advantage. The other half was the precision of timing. American forward observers, who were among the soldiers most likely to carry an A11 or equivalent watch, could call in fire missions and coordinate the timing of the barrage with the infantry advance because both the observer and the infantry sergeant were counting the same seconds. The observer did not need to send a runner to tell the sergeant when the barrage would lift. The sergeant already knew. He had a watch. He had the plan. He could act on his own. This pattern, American small units moving with a precision that seemed mechanical, almost inhuman in its timing, was something German defenders in Normandy described over and over in their after-action reports. They described artillery falling on their positions with what felt like clockwork regularity, followed immediately, within seconds, by infantry assaults that arrived as if the attackers had known to the second when the shelling would stop. The word the Germans kept reaching for was coordination. The Americans seemed coordinated in a way that went beyond training, beyond doctrine, beyond the visible chain of command. They seemed to know when things were going to happen before they happened. They did know. They had watches. This is not to say that the wristwatch was the secret weapon of the American army. It was not. It was one instrument in a vast logistical apparatus that included more trucks, more radios, more ammunition, more fuel, more food, more medicine, and more of virtually everything else than any army in history had ever fielded. But the watch was, in some ways, the purest expression of what that apparatus meant, because a watch is a personal object. It is not shared. It is not stored in a depot. It is strapped to one man's wrist. And the fact that the American system could afford to give that one man his own personal precision instrument was a statement about the philosophy of that system. It said that the individual soldier matters. It said that his ability to know the time, to coordinate independently, to act on a schedule without waiting to be told, was worth the cost of a watch, the cost of a factory, the cost of an entire industrial program. The German system did not make that statement, not because German officers did not value their soldiers, but because the German economy could not afford to. The German war machine in 1944 was, beneath its fearsome reputation, a logistical patchwork. The Wehrmacht that fought on the Western Front was still, in the main, a horse-drawn army. Over the course of the war, the German military employed approximately 2.75 million horses and mules. At any given time, roughly 1.1 million horses were in active service. Of the 264 German divisions that were active in November of 1944, only 42 were fully armoured or mechanized. The rest moved their guns, their ammunition, their food, and their wounded by horse and wagon, on roads that American fighter bombers owned from dawn to dusk. A military that could not motorize its supply columns could not put a wristwatch on every rifleman's wrist. The horses and the missing watches were expressions of the same underlying reality. Germany did not have enough of anything. The German generals knew this. They said so. Not in public, not during the war, but afterward, when the cameras were off and the memoirs were being drafted, they said what the missing watches had been quietly saying all along. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who commanded German forces in the West, identified 3 factors that made Allied victory inevitable in his post-war assessment: Allied air supremacy, the German fuel shortage, and the destruction of the German rail network. All 3 were, at their root, expressions of industrial capacity. The Allies could build more planes. The Allies could produce more fuel. The Allies could replace what they lost. The Germans could not. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, described the carpet bombing that preceded Operation Cobra at St. Lo on July 25, 1944, in terms that bordered on disbelief. His division, one of the best equipped in the entire Wehrmacht, was, in Bayerlein's own words, annihilated. He reported that over 70% of his soldiers were either dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed after a single afternoon of air attack on a scale the German military could not duplicate and could not defend against. The division fought on with a fraction of its strength, but Bayerlein's assessment of what that afternoon meant was unambiguous. He did not blame his men. He did not blame his tactics. He blamed mathematics. The Americans simply had more of everything. Major General Friedrich Wilhelm von Mellenthin, one of the most thoughtful German staff officers of the war, wrote in his post-war account Panzer Battles that massed armour had no hope of success against an enemy who enjoyed supreme command of the air. Mellenthin was describing a fact that applied far beyond air power. It applied to artillery shells, to truck tires, to radio sets, to medical supplies, to rations, and to wristwatches. Supreme command did not mean having more of one thing. It meant having more of everything. It meant that the Americans rained artillery on German positions in quantities that never ceased to shock defenders whose own batteries had to count every shell. It meant that American units could be resupplied, reinforced, and re-equipped at a pace the German logistics system could not approach. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, I would be honoured to hear their story in the comments. What unit? Where did they serve? What did they carry? Those personal details, the specific, small, human things, matter more than any production statistic. They are the real record of the war, and they deserve to be kept alive by the families who carry them. And Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who understood logistics better than almost any German general and who was given command of the Atlantic Wall defences in late 1943 precisely because he understood what was coming, said it with his usual bluntness. He wrote that anyone who had to fight, even with the most modern weapons, against an enemy in complete command of the air, was fighting like a savage against modern European troops, under the same handicaps and with the same chances of success. Rommel was talking about air power, but the principle extended to every category of material. The American advantage was not qualitative. German tanks were often better than American tanks. German machine guns were often better than American machine guns. German optical sights, German small arms, German engineering in a dozen categories were as good or better than their American equivalents. The German advantage was specific. The American advantage was total. The Americans did not win by building a better watch. They won by building millions of watches, putting one on every sergeant, every corporal, every forward observer, every radio man, every platoon leader, and letting those men coordinate independently, without waiting for orders from above, in a web of synchronized time that stretched from the artillery battery to the foxhole. There is a deeper layer to this story that goes beyond factories and production numbers, and it is the layer that the German officers, even the most perceptive among them, had the most difficulty seeing. The American military's decision to distribute watches as widely as it did was not just a logistical choice, it was a philosophical one. It was a statement about where the army believed decisions should be made. A military that gives a watch only to its officers is a military that believes time belongs to the officers. The officers decide when things happen. The officers coordinate. The officers control the tempo. The enlisted men execute. This was, broadly, the German model. It was hierarchical. It was efficient when the hierarchy functioned. And it was catastrophically fragile when the hierarchy was disrupted, when officers were killed, when communications were cut, when the chain of command fractured under the pressure of combat. A military that gives a watch to its sergeants and corporals and forward observers and squad leaders is a military that believes time belongs to everyone. It is a military that expects the man in the foxhole to coordinate with the man in the next foxhole without waiting for an officer to tell them both what to do. It is a military that trusts the lowest-ranking man in the unit to read the time, to know the plan, and to act on his own judgment when the plan meets reality. The Americans did not articulate this philosophy in any manual. They did not call it a doctrine. They simply built the watches, shipped the watches, and handed them out. The philosophy was in the distribution. It was in the assumption, so deeply embedded in the American way of doing things that it did not need to be stated, that the man on the spot should have the tools to act without permission. An American sergeant in the hedgerows of Normandy did not need to ask his lieutenant what time the barrage was scheduled to lift. He had a watch. He could read it himself. He could make his own decision about when to move, and he did. This was the thing the Germans could see but could not quite name. They described it as coordination. They described it as material superiority. They described it as luck. They described it as the American tendency toward chaos that somehow produced order. What they were actually watching was a kind of distributed authority that their own system, despite all its doctrinal talk of mission tactics and decentralized command, had never achieved at the level of the ordinary soldier. The German system gave its officers the freedom to decide how to accomplish a mission. The American system, almost by accident, gave its sergeants the tools to execute a mission without needing to be told the how or the when. The watch on the sergeant's wrist was one of those tools. It was a small one, but it was the one you could see from across a field with a pair of binoculars glinting on the wrist of a man who should not, by German standards, have been trusted with it. The German precision instrument industry, the industry that should have been able to match and exceed American watch production, did not fail because it lacked skill. It failed because it was consumed by the same war it was trying to support. The watchmakers of Glashütte were making fuses. The jewelers of Porzheim were making detonators. The craftsmen of the Black Forest were making timing mechanisms for torpedoes and mines. Every precision worker who was redirected to munitions production was a worker who was not making a watch for a soldier who needed one. And every factory that was converted to fuse production was a factory that was not producing the instruments that would have allowed German squads to coordinate the way American squads did. The system was eating itself. The same thing happened to the German officer corps on the Eastern Front, where the most experienced leaders were killed faster than they could be replaced. The same thing happened to the German fuel supply, which was consumed by the operations it was supposed to sustain. And the same thing happened to the German precision industry, which was dismantled to build the weapons that could not win the war without the instruments the industry had been dismantled to stop producing. Then Pforzheim burned, and the question became academic. It is worth pausing here to note that the American watch advantage was not just a contrast with Germany, it was a contrast with every combatant in the war. The British, America's closest ally, had their own military watch program, but it lagged significantly behind the American effort. The standard British Army issue was the General Service Trade Pattern pocket watch, a serviceable but deliberately old-fashioned instrument that officers and NCOs hung from a chain or clipped to a uniform. The British did eventually commission a wristwatch program, the famous Dirty Dozen, a set of 12 Swiss manufacturers who produced wristwatches to a WWW specification, which stood for watch, wrist, waterproof. These were excellent watches, but they arrived essentially at the war's end, in late 1945, too late to affect the fighting in any meaningful way. For most of the war, British forces relied on a mix of personal watches, pre-war military issue, and whatever they could obtain through their own supply channels. The Soviet Union was in even worse shape. Soviet military watches were crude by Western standards, essentially pocket watch movements converted into wristwatches, and they were scarce. The Red Army also received American and Swiss watches through Lend-Lease and other channels, but the distribution was nowhere near comprehensive. The Soviet soldier fought much of the war without reliable personal timekeeping. The American distinction was not the idea of giving soldiers watches. Every major army understood the need. The American distinction was the scale. The sheer industrial muscle that allowed one country to produce enough precision instruments to equip not just its specialists, but a meaningful proportion of its entire fighting force, while simultaneously producing the trucks, the tanks, the aircraft, the ammunition, the rations, and the 1,000 other items that an army crossing an ocean to fight a war on two fronts required in quantities that staggered the imagination. The American system did not face the German contradiction of choosing between watches and fuses, because the American system had something the German system did not. It had surplus. It had enough industrial capacity to make watches and fuses, enough factories to produce bomb timers and wrist chronometers, enough trained workers to fill military contracts, and still import 4 million Swiss watches in 6 months to keep the civilian market supplied. The American war economy was not choosing between watches and weapons. It was producing both. This was the fact that German generals, in their most honest moments, kept circling back to. Not that the Americans were better soldiers, not that American tactics were superior, but that the Americans simply had more. More of everything. More than the Germans could match, more than the Germans could destroy, more than the Germans could even accurately count. Rundstedt said it with the weary clarity of a man who had spent 3 years trying to fight an ocean with a bucket. Bayerlein said it with the shock of a man who had watched his division disappear in an afternoon. Mellenthin said it with the precision of a staff officer who had done the arithmetic and understood that the numbers were never going to add up. Rommel said it with the bitterness of a field marshal who had been promised reinforcements that did not exist and supplies that were burning on rail cars. His logistics officers could not move because the tracks had been cut by bombers his Air Force could not intercept. None of them, as far as the historical record shows, specifically mentioned the wristwatch. They did not need to. The watch was a detail. The watches were part of a pattern so vast that naming any single item would have been like pointing at one wave and calling it the ocean. But the watches were there. They were on the wrists of the men who drove the trucks that carried the shells, that fed the guns, that fired the barrages, that fell with such devastating punctuality on German positions from Normandy to the Rhine. And every one of those watches was ticking at the same time, synchronized to the same second, counting down to the same moment when the American infantry would rise from cover and move forward into the space the artillery had just cleared, arriving, as the German defenders kept noting, with something close to wonder, exactly on time. The war ended in May of 1945. The watches survived. Tens of thousands of A11 watches came home in the pockets and on the wrists of the men who had carried them through North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. Most of those men did not think of their watches as historical artifacts. They were tools. Some kept wearing them for years, decades, until the movements wore out, and the cases tarnished, and the luminous paint on the dials stopped glowing in the dark. Some put them in desk drawers and forgot about them. Some gave them to their sons, who gave them to their sons, who eventually brought them to antique dealers or posted them on collector forums, not always knowing what they had. There is a bitter irony in what happened next. The very strategy that had kept the American civilian market supplied during the war, the massive importation of Swiss watches to replace the domestic production that had been diverted to the military, destroyed the American watch industry after the war. The flood of Swiss imports that had been a temporary wartime measure became permanent. American consumers, who had spent 4 years buying Swiss watches because Elgin and Waltham and Hamilton were busy making military instruments, kept buying Swiss watches after the war ended. Waltham went bankrupt in 1949. Hamilton eventually abandoned American manufacturing. Elgin closed its factory in 1968. The companies that had built the watches that helped win the war were consumed by the same global market forces that the war had set in motion. The men who came home wearing A11s came home to a country that would, within 2 decades, stop making the watches they had carried. What they had was a small, precise object that contained within its 32mm case a story no museum placard could fully tell. An A11 in working condition today sells to collectors for prices that range from a few hundred to several $1,000s, depending on the manufacturer, the condition, and the provenance. The ones with documented histories, the ones that can be traced to a specific soldier in a specific unit, are worth the most. Not because they are the rarest movements or the best preserved dials, but because they carry with them a story that no amount of Swiss craftsmanship can replicate. They were there. They ticked through the seconds that mattered. What those watches contained, beyond their movements and their dials and their chromium-plated cases, was one of the most important truths of the 20th century, that wars are not won only by courage. They are not won only by strategy. They are not won only by the individual brilliance of commanders or the individual bravery of soldiers, though both matter enormously and both deserve to be remembered. Wars are won by systems, by the ability to produce, to distribute, to synchronize, to coordinate, to put the right tool in the right hand at the right moment, millions of times over, across thousands of miles, for years, without interruption. The German army had brilliant commanders. It had brave soldiers. It had, in many categories, superior equipment. What it did not have was a system that could put a watch on every soldier's wrist. And in the end, that was the gap that nothing else could close. Not the Panther tank, not the 88mm gun, not the doctrine of mission tactics that the Germans had spent a century refining. The watch on the American private's wrist was not, in the strictest sense, something the army issued to every single soldier who served. That claim, which has become a kind of folk truth in the decades since the war, is not quite accurate, and accuracy matters too much to let it pass. The A11 and its variants were issued primarily to pilots, navigators, forward observers, artillery crews, airborne troops, NCOs, and officers. The ordinary infantry rifleman might or might not receive a government-issued watch, depending on his unit, his role, and the supply situation. But American soldiers carried watches in such extraordinary numbers through a combination of military issue, personal ownership, and wartime availability that to German eyes the effect was indistinguishable from universal distribution. When a German soldier looked across a field at a squad of American prisoners or casualties and saw a watch on every wrist, he was not wrong about what he was seeing. He was seeing a country where an ordinary working man could own a precision instrument, where a private's pay could buy what a German sergeant could not afford, and where the military supply chain was deep enough that even the gaps in official issue were filled by the sheer purchasing power of the soldiers themselves. That is, in some ways, a more remarkable fact than universal issue would have been. It means the watches were not just a product of military planning, they were a product of a society in which time belonged to everyone, not just to officers. A society in which the expectation of individual competence, individual equipment, individual readiness was so deeply embedded that it did not need to be mandated. The soldiers brought the watches themselves, the same way they brought the mechanical aptitude and the habit of independent action that their officers kept noticing and their German opponents kept failing to explain. The German soldiers at the Borgnesse crossroads in December of 1944, the ones who stripped watches off the wrists of American prisoners, may or may not have understood what they were looking at. They may have seen only loot. They may have seen useful instruments to replace ones they never had. They may not have thought about it at all. In the chaos of an advance that was already beginning to stall for lack of fuel, that their supply system could not deliver on roads, their engineers could not keep open under air attack from planes, their air force could not intercept. But what they were holding, when they held those watches, was a measurement, not of time, of distance. The distance between what their country could produce and what the country across the Atlantic could produce. The distance between an army that counted its watches and an army that stopped counting because there were too many to track. The distance between a system that told its soldiers when to move and a system that gave its soldiers the tools to decide for themselves. That distance was the war. It was measured in tons of shipping and gallons of fuel and rounds of ammunition and numbers of trucks and all the vast impersonal quantities that historians tabulate in their appendices. But it was also measured in something small enough to strap to a man's wrist, something precise enough to synchronize a barrage, something personal enough to carry home in a pocket and put in a drawer and forget about for 40 years until a grandson found it and asked what it was. It was a watch. It told the time. And in the winter of 1944, in the frozen crossroads of the Ardennes, the time it told was the one thing the German army did not want to hear. That the war was no longer about who fought better, it was about who had more. And the answer, ticking quietly on the wrist of every American private, in every frozen field from Bastogne to the Rhine, was always the same. If this investigation gave you something to think about, subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are many more of these stories. Stories about the objects, the tools, the small specific things that the men of that war carried with them, and that carried the war. The things that do not make it into the grand histories but that mattered, in the cold and the mud and the dark, more than anyone who was not there could possibly know.